We call for the establishment of a First Nations voice enshrined in the Constitution.
The significance of what happened at Uluru should never be underestimated.
Hey you mob, with the federal election coming up, let's discuss the proposal for an Indigenous voice to Parliament. But what is it exactly? Why is it important? And what do our pollies in Canberra have to say about it? Let's get into it. The Voice to Parliament was a key idea to come out of a massive summit of First Nations people back in 2017. From that summit, the Uluru Statement from the Heart was delivered. Indigenous leaders there said the nation needed a First Nations voice so that we can have more of a say on big issues that affect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. And your vote could impact how a voice to Parliament could end up. So firstly, what is an Indigenous voice to Parliament? As you can probably guess from the name, it aims to provide some input to the Parliament on any laws, policies and legislation which impact Indigenous communities.
The voice would allow First Peoples to have a say in law, be able to recommend policies for the good of First Nations people. The key difference from it and prior recommendations is it is enshrined in the Constitution.
So why is it needed? Well, it brings decision-making back into Indigenous communities.
So an Indigenous voice to Parliament is one of those next steps of reconciliation. It's about how do we acknowledge the First Peoples of this country in our founding documents? How do we embrace who our First Nations people are as part of who we are as a modern nation?
So let's discuss how the different parties are looking to implement this voice if they win the election. The Coalition, which is made up of the Liberal and National parties, has put forward a model which involves two levels of Indigenous advisory bodies, at a regional level and at a national level. Currently, the Coalition says an Indigenous voice to Parliament doesn't necessarily need to go in our Constitution. So basically, they think it can be established first without holding a referendum. Advocates for putting the voice in the Constitution say it takes the ability away from the government to possibly dissolve it down the track. However, the Coalition also believes that if a referendum is held to create an Indigenous voice, there's a risk that it might not succeed. And that's because referendums don't have a great track record in Australia.
If you fail on a question for a constitutional referendum, it is never resurrected. 8 have been successful against 42 attempts. I don't want this to fail.
Labor, on the other hand, says it's fully committed to the Uluru Statement from the Heart and says it will hold a referendum to enshrine the voice in the Constitution.
Our Labor government will work with First Nations people to implement the Uluru Statement from the Heart in full.
And the Greens, like Labor, are pushing for a truth-telling commission and a treaty, both of which were recommendations from the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which called for a federal Makarrata commission to supervise truth-telling and agreement-making between First Nations people and governments. The Greens say they want to launch a nationwide consultation on treaties, which could then inform how First Nations people are represented in Parliament, in policy and decision-making.
The really deeply held view from the Greens is that the best chance of all of the elements, including voice, succeeding from the Uluru Statement is to have that process of truth and treaty at least commenced first.
And by the way, there's already been some movement on this. Recently, Victoria opened Australia's first truth-telling commission, and Queensland, Tasmania and the Northern Territory are now in the early stages of a path towards a treaty or treaties. If you're keen to learn more, check out the Uluru Statement from the Heart website. But remember, before you head to the polls, just know that your vote will have an impact on how we create an Indigenous voice to Parliament and affect the future lives of First Nations people.